Hi again, Sophie Glenn here, and I'm doing bandsaw number 2. So my first video went over just the sort of general safety precautions and a couple of basic demonstrations on how to use the bandsaw. One of them being making a curved shape like this, or in this case it's a semicircle. So a couple little points about this. Depending on the width of your blade, you're only going to get so much of a diameter cut out of it. So the wider your blade is, the wider your diameter needs to be, if that makes any sense. So to put it in a different way, basically the width of the blade, if you're trying to make too drastic of a curve, it'll basically bind up on the back end of it. So when you start cutting, the blade basically just won't want to twist because it wants to stay flat. So it'll bind up on the back side of the blade and do weird, funky things. So generally speaking, usually a blade this has a 3/8 inch blade on it, so that'll probably cut maybe 4 inches. It might be a little bit wider than that. But usually if you're unsure about the diameter that you need to cut, just make sure to do relief cuts before you're making a semicircle like this. Or if there's another, like if you're making a really small circle, like a 2-inch circle, you might be able to do that with a Forstner bit on the drill press. So if you're not sure, pretty much just ask me or ask whatever shop tech that you have working for you, and then they'll steer you in the right direction. So a little addendum to that first video. Okay, so in this video I want to talk about 2 methods of making more or less straight cuts on here. So the first method is using the miter gauge here, and this is generally used for cross cuts. So if you're going across the grain, this is a piece of plywood, so it's not the best example, but if you're going across the grain of the wood, so you're making, so if the grain's going this direction, you're going perpendicular to that, those are cross cuts. So the miter gauge is great for that. What's nice about the miter gauge, it just slips in and out of this little channel here, so it rides nice and smooth, hopefully nice and smoothly in there if it's waxed properly. This was a little squeaky before, so we'll do our best. If I do a little close-up here, it's got this nice little measuring gauge on it, so it goes all the way up to 30 inches in both directions. So to use it, I can just untwist this handle, and I have this little point to steer me in the right direction, and I can set this up to whatever angle I need to cut at. So say someone's using the table saw or the compound miter gauge and you need to cut 45s, you can in a pinch actually cut it up on here. So you can set this up to 45 and you can get nice 45-degree cuts on it if it's set up properly. And you can use this. So again, that kind of lends nicely to the versatility of this tool, so you don't necessarily need a table saw or a compound miter saw in a shop that you're trying to develop. So a bandsaw can do a lot of this work for you. So there are a lot of reasons why people love this machine, including myself. So I'm just going to set this up to 90 just for the sake of demonstration. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to cut up my piece of plywood, and you kind of need to make sure you have a nice straight edge on this already, or a straight face, because that's going to help you. You're going to reference off of the face here off of this miter gauge. So if your piece of wood isn't straight, then you're not going to get really accurate cuts. So you need to make sure that you already have kind of a straight edge on here. If this wasn't a piece of plywood, I would say you can joint this edge. So if it's just a regular piece of wood, then you can just joint that edge really fast and make sure that it's nice and flush. But this is a piece of plywood, so I'm kind of assuming that it's already nice and straight, and this is from the scrap bin. It looked pretty straight. If you're not sure, you could just take a nice straight edge up against here and make sure that it's nice and straight and you don't see any light in between the straight edge and the piece of wood that you're using. So that's another way you can go about finding out if something's straight or not. Okay, so what I want to do first is make sure this is at the right height, which it is. Again, we don't want a lot of exposed blade on here because that can be very bad for our fingers. So you want to make sure that's set up at the right height. Sorry, I got an itch on my eyebrows, so I got to take care of that. I also have my safety glasses and my earmuffs on. And I'm only doing a couple of shortcuts, and since for the purposes of the video, I don't really want to turn the dust collection on because it does get very loud, so I'm just going to leave it off. And I'm only doing a couple of small cuts, so I'm not really too worried about the dust collection here. So what I'll do is I'll hold this up against here, and I can do this one-handed, which is nice. But I can also come over here and sort of just give it a little extra support over here as well. But typically, if you can do it with one hand, then that's totally appropriate. So I'll go ahead and cut that. So I'm not going to push that piece of wood out of the way yet. I'm just going to finish off my cuts. And if I wanted to push it away, I can use a push stick over here. If I can get it out. And use this to push them away, like so. Stopping the blade, push that out of the way. So now I got a bunch of little squares. Yay, fun squares. Awesome. Okay. So again, that's pretty much the miter gauge. So if I wanted to, say, make a spline mitered frame or something like that, and all the other tools are being occupied by somebody else, then you can cut your 45s on here or whatever angle you need to cut, and you're good to go. So that's the miter gauge. And this tool creeps up in a lot of other machines, so I'll probably talk about it more in depth when we get to those. So be sure to watch those videos as well. So I'll set him aside for just a minute. All right, so now I have this fence here. So this works similarly to the one that's on the table saw, wherein there's a little measurement on this little bar here, and this just locks and unlocks in place. Right, so if I lift this up, it unlocks it, push it down, locks it into place. And what's nice about it, has this nice aluminum thing on here. And if I take this off, hopefully, oops, be a little fussy today, but that's all right. So there's a nice little aluminum guard on here. So if I cut into it just a tiny bit, then it's not really going to do all that much damage to the blade, although you really don't want to cut into it, just FYI. It's got a nice aluminum guard, and I can cut, if I'm doing straight cuts, straight rip cuts, so going with the grain of the wood this time, this is going to help me keep it nice and flat up against that face. All right, so again, really similar to how the fence on the joiner and the fence on the table saw work in that respect. So I'll set that back in place. And again, there's a little gauge on here, so I can set this up to whatever measurement I need. And again, for this, you kind of need to already have a straight edge. So this is a solid piece of wood here, so I can easily just go ahead and joint this. So just joint that edge really quick. I don't necessarily need a flat face, but as long as I got one flat edge, then I'm good to go. And depending on what you actually need this for, then you might be able to get away with some stuff. But you just want to make sure that your edge is nice and flush up against that fence. So this is good enough for what I'm using it for. Again, I have a high spot right here, so I'll want to lift this up a little bit. So you can see it's getting caught right here. Just lift that up just a bit. And to double check, I'll clear that, and that works just fine. So I'll walk that back up. And then I'll just cut just a little bit off of this. That should work. And I'll go ahead and cut that. So the trick here is to kind of keep this nice and flush in line here. So I'm going to use my right hand to push it up against the fence here, and I'm going to keep my right hand here. And then when I get towards the end, I'll use a push stick to push it all the way through. So again, very similar to how it works on the table saw. Okay, so I'll go ahead and do that. And my right hand staying right here. Kind of wanted to move off the fence a little bit towards the back, so then I just took my right hand and sort of pushed it back forward. And I got a nice straight piece there. Right, so I actually did a pretty decent job. I'm okay with that. And I got a nice little stick for stirring up paint or Bondo or whatever I need to stir up. So that's this part of the fence. So you'll notice here that this is quite a bit higher than the guide here. Right, so at a certain point, I'll hit that guide and it won't be able to do anything, right? So at this point, I can only cut about 2 inches off here. So if you're cutting 2 inches, that might be okay. We really don't want this to touch the guide all that much. So in that case, what we do is, set this down for a minute. If I lift this up, you'll notice on the back here, there's these 2 little screws. So if I unscrew those, I don't need to unscrew them all the way, or little knobs, I guess. Then I can pull this out, I might push this down, and then I can actually flip this 90 degrees, and then tighten that back up. And I can use this profile now. So now I can actually get under those guides and actually cut a really thin piece off if I wanted to, which is nice. So it's got a much lower profile now. And now in this case, it works pretty much exactly the same way. So I'll go ahead and demonstrate that too. So I'll lock that in place. And we'll say that's where I want to cut. And it's just right underneath the guides here. So in this case, I'm still keeping my right hand pushing up against this fence. Instead, now I can't really get a push stick under here, so I'm just going to use my right hand to pull it forward and against the fence. Slowing down again at the end of my cut. Okay. And that's that. I got a nice little straight piece again. Yeah, so that's the rip fence.